Hello and welcome to Topic 5, Lecture 1. And in this lecture, we're going to look at the gender gap. So, what are we going to be covering in this lecture? Well, we're going to first define the concept of gender gap, and then we're going to look at specific areas where we find the gender gap in voter turnout, public opinion, and party identification. In the next lecture for this week, we're going to take a look at the gender gap in representation. That is, the gender gap in representation in Congress. So let's go ahead and get started. So the gender gap is defined as the difference between women and men as reflected in social, political, intellectual, cultural, or economic attainments or attitudes. And that's a definition from the World Economic Forum, which is dedicated to taking a look at inequalities between groups. And so when we're talking about the gender gap, we're really just talking about measuring differences. And so we could talk about differences between the gender pay gap. So do men get paid more than women? We could look at the educational attainment in terms of are women getting more degrees than men, hiring, etc. But in this lecture, we're going to look particularly at the gender gap as it refers to voter turnout, public opinion, and party ID. All right, so before we can talk about the gender gap in voter turnout, let's define what we mean by voter turnout. So voter turnout is pretty simple. It is the number of voters as a proportion of eligible voters. So let's say that you lived in a really small city. It had 100 eligible voters, and of those 100 eligible voters, 10 showed up to vote. That means you would have a voter turnout rate of 10%. So how do voters turn out in the United States? Well, in general, it kind of depends on the election. That we have higher levels of voter turnout for certain elections and lower turnout for other elections. So the highest level of voter turnout that we have in the United States is during presidential elections. So 2020 was a presidential election. The next one is in 2024. The lowest level of voter turnout is, not surprisingly, local elections. Elections for school board, for mayoral seats, for common council. When you look at the 2020 election, that was a presidential election year, 155 million people voted. And that was about 2/3 of the eligible voter population. And so about 67% of voters who were eligible to vote actually did vote, about 7 out of 10. And this was the highest turnout that we've had in a presidential election in decades. It used to be that voter turnout, as you'll see on the next slide, would hover in the 50%, but in the last several election cycles, we've seen increases in voter turnout. And this graph shows you that trend in voter turnout for the last several decades. And so let me put my magic pen on here. And, this says, it says that however you measure it, voter turnout jumped in 2020. And so that, there's different ways that political scientists estimate the eligible voters. But the big takeaway here is in 1980 that we see that, about 55% of people turned out to vote in the United States. The low point was in 1996, where we had 50% voter turnout for a presidential election. That means only 1 out of every 2 people voted. But we've seen since 2012, we've seen this increase. Well, or I guess starting really in the election of President Obama in 2008, we see an increase in voter turnout in the highest level in 2020. That's an improvement for the United States, but still the United States lags behind other countries like us in terms of voter turnout. We have relatively low voter turnout compared to other countries, but we've seen some improvement in the last few years. So now let's turn our sights to the gender gap in voter turnout. And so if I were to ask you, and maybe just, think for a second before you, move on to the next slide, if I were to ask you, who do you think is more likely to turn out to vote in a presidential election? Do you think that men or women have higher voter turnout rates in the United States? So you might think men because it's like politics, it's an arena of men. Women just, got the right to vote in 1920. So, initially they had lower voter turnout than men. Is that something that's persisted? Or do you think that more women show up to vote than men? Well, the answer is that women have a higher voter turnout rate. They have a higher voter turnout rate, not just for presidential elections, but for midterm elections and other elections as well. So let's look at some slides to illustrate this gap in voter turnout. So as this graph shows that since 1984, women have had a higher rate of voter turnout than men have. And prior to 1980, in 1980 it was about the same, but prior to that women lagged behind men in terms of voter turnout. But that changes, and we'll talk later in the lecture about why in the 1984 is important. The election after 1980 is important. We'll talk about the changing demographics of the parties and issues. We'll talk about that in a moment, but let's take a look at this first. So the green line is women and the yellow line is men. And on the bottom here, it basically shows you the different presidential elections. And so you can see that starting in 1984, that women turn out to vote at higher rates than men. And that gap stays pretty constant and actually grows here in the 2000 election, where that 68.4% of women voted as compared to 65% of men. And so we have this gap that has been persistent, but has actually increased in the last several years. So in the 2020 election, as we already noted, there was a turnout of 155 million voters. Of those voters, 72 million of them were men and 82 million of the voters were women. And so there you see the gap in voter turnout. 68% of women turned out to vote, while only 65% of men turned out to vote. And so women are more likely to vote in a presidential election than are men. And it's about a 3.4 percentage difference point. And so, women overall, when you look at the 155 million voters, women made up 53% of the 2022 voters, which is 10 million more voters than men. And so 10 million more women voted than men. And that's pretty significant. That it's nearly the same as 2016, which was a 4 percentage point difference. And this is a cool slide because it shows you what we just talked about. On the top here is the gender gap during presidential elections. And so for presidential elections, that women are in yellow and men are in blue. And so you can kind of compare the yellow dot or to the blue dot, and then you can sort of see the gap. So not a big gap in 1980, but a little bit of a gap. And then we can see in presidential elections that gap, is fairly significant and also, pretty stable as well. You might be asking yourself, do we see the same kind of gender voter turnout gaps in the midterm elections? And so the midterm elections, we have a midterm election coming up this year in 2022. And in midterm elections, those are congressional elections. All of the House is up for re-election, and only 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election. We generally have lower levels of voter turnout because, see here, this shows you the general rate of voter turnout, and then includes the gap. And then you can see that turnout in the midterm elections is not as robust as it is in presidential elections. That makes sense. People are paying more attention during presidential years. And then we also see less of a gender gap in the midterm elections, at least until 2000. But then, the difference between blue being women and gray being men, we see that starts happening in 2000 and in 2002, and then again in 2006, right? And then you sort of see 2012, a little bit of an increase in the gender voting gap. But then that in 2018, we see this huge spike, okay? And so not only do we see increased in voter turnout because it was sort of seen as a backlash to the Trump presidency, but you also see that more women showed up for the midterm elections than did men. So as we know that there is an upcoming midterm election in just a few weeks. And so the 2022 midterm election is on Tuesday, November 8th. The big question is will the gender gap in voter turnout either stay the same as the 2018 election, or will it increase, okay? Or will it decrease, right? I think that, in 2018, there was a big backlash among women against Trump, and they showed up and voted quite robustly, right, in the 2018 midterm elections, and that had consequences, right? The House went into the hands of the Democrats at that point. And so the thinking is that, well, that was a very specific circumstance, and maybe there won't be that strong of a gender gap in this upcoming midterm election. However, that because Roe v. Wade was overturned in the case Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health, that people are speculating that just as women came out to vote robustly in 2018, maybe they're going to come out and vote robustly in 2022 because of the rising concern over reproductive rights. And so some are predicting, yes, that we're going to continue to see this gender gap with more women turning out to vote than men. But we'll have to wait and see once the midterm elections to see whether or not that is the case. Okay, so we know that women are more likely to vote in presidential and midterm elections than men. But the question is why? Why are women more likely to vote? Well, there's no consensus on the cause in terms of political scientists and social scientists, that there's no one agreement on why women are more likely to vote. But there are a few theories that seem plausible, so I will put them out there because these are some of the reasons that political scientists have given to explain the gender gap in voter turnout. So one theory is that women are more likely to be beneficiaries of safety net services, okay? And so when you think about safety net services, you might think of things such as food stamps, rental assistance, vouchers for paying for daycare, tax credits, child tax credits, those sorts of things, okay? And so the thinking is that women are more likely to partake or be beneficiaries of economic supports that are there that come from the federal government and from the state governments. And the reason for that is just the sheer reality that women are more likely to be poor in the United States. That 56% of those that are living in poverty are women. And that's mostly due to the fact that the highest household, when you look at households in the United States, that the households that have the highest level of poverty are single family households where it's a single mother who is the head of household with children. Okay, so single mothers who are the head of household with children, those are the families that in the households that are most likely to be in poverty. And so if you are in poverty, that you are going to most likely be using safety net services, right? And that you might feel more invested in the political process because if the public policies around safety net services change, then you're going to, change in terms of reducing those benefits or change in terms of increasing those benefits, right? You're going to pay attention a little bit more to voting in elections. Women, I don't have this up here, but women are also have a longer life expectancy. And so because of that, then they would be in need of Social Security for a longer period of time. So that could be a primary driver. Women are more likely to be primary caregivers for children and primary caregivers for the elderly as well. So elder care. It says there that the AARP reports that 2/3 of the primary caretakers for children and elders are women. So again, that then there might be more interest in making sure that there's paid family leave, right? Because women are more likely to be those primary caregivers, and also tax credits for childcare as well. And so the thinking here is that exposure to government policies, right, that you're more likely to use those government policies, and so that because you have this exposure to government policies, you know what it's like to get them, you know what it's like to lose them, that it makes political outcomes, aka elections, right, who gets elected, it makes it more salient or more important for women. And therefore, they might be more motivated to participate in the political process. And so that's one of the theories that's out there to help us understand that gap in voter turnout. Okay, so now let's turn to our second topic, which is the gender gap in public opinion. And let's define our terms. And so this is from my American government textbook. Public opinions are the attitudes that people have about policies, events, elected officials, and politics. Okay. So, if I asked you, do you approve of the job that Joe Biden is doing? And you say, yes, I do, or no, I don't. That's going to be your public opinion about the attitude that you have to elected officials. If I asked you about, the war in Ukraine, right, which just has escalated within the last 24 hours, and then you could say, if you have an attitude about that you feel like Ukraine is, should not negotiate with the Russians and that they should continue fighting, or if you say, no, they should negotiate with the Russians, again, that's an example of a public opinion. It's an attitude you have about an event. Okay. So that there is a gap in public opinion on some issues, but not all issues. Okay. And we're going to take a look at that gender gap in public opinion. So as it says there, that women and men hold different opinions on several key issues, including gun control, reproductive rights, and social welfare programs. Let's take a look at those. Okay, so this is some public polling data from the American National Election Studies. So that's the ANES up there in the corner there. They've been doing every 4 years during the presidential election cycle. The University of Michigan conducts a huge survey throughout the United States about a lot of different things, but one of the things they survey is attitudes about certain issues. And it's been going on since 1948, and this is the latest one. We'll get another one in 2024. And here I'm showing you that, that here's the issue that they asked about, and here is how women responded to it. Here's how men responded to it. And then in this, it shows you the gap. That is the difference between women's attitudes and men's attitudes. The first one is the federal government should make it more difficult to buy a gun. No surprise there. Women are a lot more supportive of gun control measures than are men. That you see the difference, 55 to 43, about a 12-point difference, okay? And so that even with a margin of error of, let's say, 2%, 3%, that this poll probably has, that is still a significant difference in terms of the opinion on gun control. Favor requiring employers to offer paid leave to parents of new children. It's a significant gap, 7.5. Women are more likely to support that than men. However, we do have robust support well over a majority for both men and women. Allow transgender people to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces. You see a gap here. Women are more likely to support that position than men, but still under a majority. Less of a gap when it comes to allowing gay and lesbian couples to be married. There's a lot more support for that in the United States, and there's not big differences between men and women. And the federal spending on aid to the poor should be increased. Now, this comes in second in terms of the gap. Women are more likely to support helping out the poor than are men. Kind of goes back to what we were talking about on the previous slide. This shows you comparing, this is from the Pew Research Center, and this is about asking the question of, would you rather have a bigger government with more services or a smaller government with fewer services? The yellow line says, hey, you'd like to have a smaller government with fewer services. The purple line is saying that, oh no, you'd like a bigger government with more services. This shows you the public opinion over time, women on this side, men on this side. And so, that we see that that among women, less, kind of similar opinions there for a while, but now women are much more likely to support a bigger government than men. And so you sort of see here the purple line has always been, above the purple line for men. Men support less of a robust service oriented government. Women have consistently supported more, but that we see that gap growing. 56%, or what is that? 58% of women support more services, and in 2019, only 37%. So another gender gap. The last public opinion issue area we're going to take a look at is on reproductive freedoms. And you would think that there would be a pretty significant gender gap when it comes to attitudes about reproductive freedoms. But as you see there, and this is from the Pew Research Center data, but this graph actually comes from the politics website 538, which crunches data all the time, and I encourage you to take a look at 538. It's a really great resource for a lot of different political issues, but also for sports issues as well, if you're into sports. But as it says there, that women and men have very similar views on abortion. So there's a little bit of a gender gap, but it's probably not as robust as you might have thought it would have been. And so, here, basically saying, they're asking the question, there are some cases when abortion should be legal, others where it should be illegal. And that women say, yep, that when asked that question, do you think there are some times when abortion should be legal and other times it should be illegal? 68% of women say, yep, that we shouldn't always be legal or always be illegal. Men, actually a little bit higher, 74%. But when you break it down, mostly legal, 42% of women say that abortion should be legal in most cases. 41% of men say, yeah, legal in most cases. Mostly illegal. That you see a little bit of a gender gap there. More men are saying, yeah, abortion should be mostly legal. Maybe it should only be mostly illegal, but maybe it should only be legal for like cases of rape and incest. But women are saying, that 26% say that it should be mostly illegal. Okay. And that, that should it be illegal in all cases, no exceptions. Gender gap there, but it's not hugely significant, 21 to 17. And within the margin of error, really no difference between abortion should be illegal in all cases. 9% of women say it should be illegal in all cases. 8% of men say it should be illegal in all cases. Okay. And so there is a little bit of a gender gap, but I bet you if I had asked you before I showed you that slide, do you think there's a gender gap when it comes to opinions on reproductive freedoms? I bet you would have said, oh yeah, that there are big differences and that there are modest differences, but mostly similar views on abortion. So there are many theories as to why there is a gender gap in public opinion. And this comes from the work of Dr. Mary Kate Lizolt from Augustana University and also from the Center for American Women in Politics. And so based on her research and others' research, there's a couple of theories about why we have this gap. One is based on gender socialization, right? That we pop out into this world and then immediately, you're identified as little baby girl or little baby boy. And from that moment, there's still a lot of gender socialization that goes on in the United States, or not just in the United States, but beyond, right? And so kids are socialized, right? And then that socialization is, carries into adulthood. And so, this theory is that young girls are socialized to be caring, to be nurturing, and men are socialized to be more assertive and more aggressive. And so because of that, socialization, that can, be reflected in, oh, do you want a government that takes care of people more, or, less, robust, government shouldn't take care of us because we could be more assertive and independent. You can sort of see how those attitudes might be response to gender socialization. It could also just be the realities of the awareness of gender-based inequalities. So let's take the example of that women are more likely to be primary caregivers for older people and for children, right? Well, then when we looked at the slide before, when it says women are more supportive of paid leave than men, right? That makes sense because they're probably more burdened by having to take care. Burden's probably not the right word, but it's challenging to take care of kids and elderly. And if that falls primarily on you as a woman, you might be more supportive of policies that provide paid leave. Value differences as well. That when you look at the different values between men and women are more likely to endorse like pro-social values, things that help the community, and that could be a product of that gender socialization. I want you to keep in mind, though, that women are not a monolithic group. All right, so that while the vast majority of women and men support reproductive freedoms, there are women, as we saw there, 9%, that abortion should be illegal in all circumstances, right? So women aren't a monolithic group. Men aren't a monolithic group, right? The role that gender intersects with race, ethnicity, party affiliation, all of those impact public opinion. Okay, and that there are different opinions within women on certain issues, within men in certain issues, and between the two as well. Okay, let's move on to our final issue for the lecture, which is the gender gap in party affiliation or party identification. When we talk about party identification, we're talking about which party do you most identify with, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, or another party. So prior to 1980s, that there really was no big difference in terms of which party men and women voted for. In other words, that just as many men voted for the Republican Party as did women. Just as many men voted for the Democratic Party as did women. Okay, there wasn't a gender gap. That changes in the 1980s. By the 1980s, a women's voting bloc manifests itself. And it remains in place until today. So second, we'll talk about what the voting bloc is, and then we'll talk about why it still remains in place. Why? What is it about 1980s? What happens in the 1980s presidential election? Because it's after that election where we start to see that women start voting for the Democratic Party and men vote more for the Republican Party. And so in the 1980s, that the GOP, the grand old party, that is the Republican Party, they become much more right-wing, much more conservative on particular social issues, particularly on issues that are of a concern to women's issues. And it's what's known as sort of the start of the so-called culture war. That is this division, this stark and growing division between social issues such as abortion, contraceptives, marriage issues, issues in terms of what the proper role of men and women in families is. Okay, all of that starts percolating after the 1980s election, and it becomes a defining force in terms of party identification moving onward. So in the 1980s, you see basically the rise of religious conservatives in the United States. And so it's the rise of the conservative religious right in the 1980s. And a lot of people think that this is it's a backlash to the social justice movements of the 1960s and 70s, right? The 1960s and 70s is social movements regarding civil rights for African Americans, but it's also a period of time, the women's liberation movement, the gay liberation movement, right? And also the hippies and the yippies, right? The free love and all of that, right? It was very, rise up of a liberal and progressive viewpoint. And in the 1980s, there's a pushback. There is this rejection of these liberal progressive ideas of the social justice movements of the 1960s and 70s. And there's this return to the traditional values that man should be the head of household, abortion is wrong, homosexuality is a sin. And, that is the culture war, right? The conservative religious right, embraces this return to traditional values. And the Republican Party, who prior to the 1980s was supportive of abortion rights, was supportive of the Equal Rights Amendment, right? Didn't take a stand on homosexuality, okay? Homosexuality really wasn't in the conversation at that point as much, but it comes into the conversation in the early parts of the 1980s. The Republican Party aligns themselves with the conservative religious right. The reason they do that is because they think they're going to be more electorally successful if they do that. And they were right. And so that they align with the conservative movement, the religious right. They begin to win elections, Ronald Reagan, and moving forward. And at that point, women start leaving the Republican Party. And here are just some pictures of some of the people who are involved in the rise of the conservative religious right. Some of these people you know because we just were learning about Phyllis Schlafly, who was at the forefront of the Stop the ERA movement, and that brought to bear this traditional return of these traditional family values. But you may not have heard of Anita Bryant. Anita Bryant, this is way before a lot of your guys' time, but Anita Bryant is known as like the orange juice person, that she was from Florida, and she was like promoted Florida orange juice. But she also was an anti-gay rights activist, right? And so in the 1970s, as some cities throughout the United States were beginning to pass anti-discrimination laws that applied to, that you can't discriminate against gays and lesbians, she fought against that, and it got some cultural traction. Jerry Falwell, religious conservative, founder of the Moral Majority, these are all part and parcel of the rise of the conservative Christian right. Then enters President Ronald Reagan. He used to be governor of California, and in fact, he was pro-choice. He was more moderate, at least in terms of social issues, not economic issues, but social issues. But he saw the writing on the wall and was like, you know what? If we want to win this election, we need to align ourselves with these more conservative social forces that are developing. And the Republican Party did that, and it was the pathway towards electoral success. So this is a visualization of the gender gap in party identification. And this is from the Pew Research Center, and it's the latest data that I could find. It goes to 2019, the 2019 poll. And so this shows from 1994 moving to 2019. And it asks the question of, and this is of registered voters, they asked, who do you identify with? Do you identify with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party? Which one do you lean towards? Because a lot of people are like, well, I'm kind of independent. And they say, well, if you add to, do you lean towards the Democrats or do you lean towards the Republicans? On the top here is men, and on the bottom here is women. And you can see pretty clearly what the difference is. Since 1994, women have identified more with the Democratic Party as compared to the Republican Party. So in 2019, 56% of women said that they either identify with the Democratic Party or they lean Democratic, while only 38% say that they are Republican or lean Republican. It's almost reversed, although so 50% of men identify or lean Republican, while 42% identify with the Democrat or lean Democrat. Okay. So bottom line is, when it comes to party identification, women are more likely to identify with the Democratic Party. Men are more likely to identify with the Republican Party. So what is the impact of the gender gap in party identification? What impact does that have on American politics? Well, that earlier in the lecture, I talked about this concept of a voting bloc, right? And a voting bloc is, a group of voters that are motivated by a common concern. And remember, when we were talking about voting rights for women, that was one of the arguments, that women were going to make a voting bloc, right? That if you give women the right to vote, then they're going to vote in a way, like a women's way, right? And they're going to vote on moral issues and issues of social justice and, alleviating poverty, right? So it's sort of like, hey, we're going to make up a voting bloc. And that didn't happen, as your textbook points out. But we see that happening more as we see this gap in terms of party identification. So if you see that there's this group of voters that are motivated by a common concern, and we sort of see that with women voters, right? That more women vote, more women are likely to be, affiliated with the Democratic Party, and the reason is because of some of their concerns, right? Increases in social spending, alleviation of poverty, abortion rights, and so on. That there might be this sense that you want to capture that voting bloc, right? Because if you capture that voting bloc, then it's going to lead to political power, and then candidates and parties begin seeing these voting blocs, right? And they see these voting blocs as a key to electoral success. And so you want to woo the bloc. And so, for the Democratic Party, since more women vote and more women are affiliated with the Democratic Party, then the Democratic Party sees women as key to their party's victory. And that's why in the midterm elections, that even though, because the Democrats are all in power, they would usually lose seats in the midterm election. But they're basically saying that because of Dobbs and because Roe's been overturned, that we're going to really focus on abortion rights so we can woo that block of potential women Democratic voters, right? And then, you could say, well, for the Republican Party, well, you want women as a bloc to vote for the Republican Party. Also, that men are more aligned with the Republican Party. And so the Republican Party might double down on issues that are more important to men, such as issues of gun control, because we saw that in the difference in public opinion. But then you could also say that you could attract women by focusing not on abortion rights, but you could focus on crime, inflation, how this is impacting your family, and lure women into the Republican Party, okay? And so when you see these gender gaps in party affiliation, that has implications for electoral politics. Okay, that's it for this lecture. In the next lecture, we're going to look at gender gap in representation in Congress, and we'll learn more about Congress in general. Thanks for paying attention, and I'll talk to you again soon.